the way that we most glorify God is by honoring our limitation and getting into the spiritual hubris of saying, I can fix everything, right? We are not supposed to be Jesus in every situation because we are not God. A lot of people haven't figured out how to separate that savior complex and learn that they honor some of their limitations as a way to glorify God.
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
Welcome to the Jesus in the Upper Left podcast. My name is Micah Dodson, and I work with Thrive Church Planting here in the Pacific Northwest. We love to serve leaders that are helping in church multiplication, and part of the vision of what we try to accomplish is to help leaders thrive, not just survive the journey of multiplying new churches and making disciples. And I've got my friend Ahshuwah here with me. Ahshuwah, why don't you introduce yourself? You're a common face on the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here with you. I serve a ministry called Brilliance Labs that seeks to empower and equip kingdom entrepreneurs that are starting new ventures here in the city of Portland, and enjoy contributing with the podcast.
And we have a guest with us today, Dominic Ibaria. Dominic, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, my name is Dominic Ibaria. I am a pastor at a church called Roots Community Church. I also am the executive director of a spiritual direction organization called Fermata Ministries. And then I also teach a little bit at George Box in their seminary. I'm a spiritual formation guide for the master's students going through the seminary as a cohort. And then I'm also a doctoral advisor, project faculty for their Doctor of Ministry program.
Okay, you're a busy dude. I know we've met through one of the churches that you're connected with, Roots, which interestingly, Roots and Brilliance Labs that Ahshuwah works with are two organizations that have helped with an initiative that's happening in the Portland area, where we've been able to get some scholarships to pastors for mental health support over this last year. And that's just such a significant need. In fact, we kind of want to talk about that in particular today. Just thinking about the coming of 2025 and the reality that most of us pastors have faced both during kind of some of the political turmoil that we as a country have experienced, as well as the pandemic and the pressures of ministry in a post-Christian context. I think one of the realities that I've noticed in sitting with pastors and helping do assessments and coaching and things like that is that many pastors lack the input that's needed to really flourish in ministry. Another way to say that is they're so busy with the output of ministry and the demands on their life that they're always, helping other people, serving other people, feeding other people, but they themselves are not the recipients of the same kind of care. And so today, what I was hoping to do is have a conversation where we talk a little bit about some of those realities of what does it look like for people in ministry to have at least input that maybe doesn't match, but is similar to the levels of output that they have in their life. A number of years ago, just kind of a quick story, I was doing an ordination interview with a pastor, and he was getting ordained in a particular denomination that I'm also ordained in, the Christian Missionary Alliance. And just asked him the question of how do you sustain yourself in the rigors of ministry? And he was a second career pastor. He had retired as an engineer, and he had a very kind of simple, concise engineering sort of answer for me. He said, I just need the input that matches the output of the ministry that I'm doing. And so as I began to ask him questions about what that looked like, I discovered that while that was a simple answer, the kind of input he had in his life was evidence of a lot of spiritual disciplines, evidence of a lot of support and outside influence in his life, pointing him towards Jesus and helping kind of fuel him up for the ministry that God called him to. So here's a couple interesting statistics that I looked up. And this one, a couple of these are pretty hard to hear and be aware of. The first is this from Barna Research, that 38% of pastors have considered quitting ministry in the past year. Now that one, I think that kind of sits with us and we're like, yep, that makes sense. Like maybe on some of our darkest days, we've thought of transitioning and maybe this isn't what I'm cut out for, that kind of a thing.
Red Truck Monday was what they call that.
Makes sense.
I love it. The next statistic, though, was a little harder for me to hear it. It's that nearly 1 in 5 U.S. pastors say that they have contemplated self-harm or suicide in the past year. 1 in 5. That's kind of a sobering statistic. One of my friends who works in the mental health profession, he says, for people in ministry, your church is only going to get as healthy as you're willing to get. And I think that kind of blended with these statistics brings us back around to this idea that we really need significant input in our lives to help us stay on course. So Dominic, you and I had a conversation months back. I don't know if you remember this, but we were talking about kind of 3 different lenses of input that different people in ministry might potentially have. And you referenced kind of an analogy about coaching, counseling, and spiritual formation as both kind of looking forward, being present in the moment, and looking back. Could you maybe describe a bit more about that if you remember the conversation, what some of your impressions were that you shared with me?
For sure. And I can't take credit for these ideas. It was my lead mentor, who was the former executive dean at George Fox, who kind of helped me put some handles on these different ideas, because it's sometimes really difficult to figure out who does what in the world of soul care, in the world of pastoring. But it broke down into some helpful categories. And the way that we talked about it was in terms of kind of a chronological emphasis. And I have a superpower. I am married to a licensed counselor. And so I have learned where my roles begin and where they end and where to refer. But as a therapist, as a licensed counselor, typically their emphasis is focusing on the past. What is it that happened that is hindering people's ability to live well and freely in that present moment? So it's a lot of trauma focus, a lot of healing from past experiences, broken relationships, lack of forgiveness. So there's a chronological emphasis on looking back. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, there's coaching that typically focuses on what the future orientation is. How do we help people get to where they want to go? Less emphasis about the conversations about the past, and it's building practical game plans, support to help people move forward into the life that they feel like God is calling them into. Spiritual directors sit in the middle, and the question they ask is, how do you connect with God in this present moment? And there are elements that can come in from the past, hopes and dreams for the future, but spiritual directors are really focused on, how do I help an individual, specifically a lot of folks in leadership, connect with God in a life-giving way in that moment? And then there is this other category called pastoring. That's kind of this wraparound service around the individual that just journeys with them through life. So that as life is lived, there's stuff in the past. As they journey and shepherd people, there's a vision for the future. So the image is that counselors are specialists helping people with past, spiritual director help people stay grounded in the present, and then coaches look to the future, but pastors shepherd them through that entire process. So each having a unique role, and the goal, I believe, is creating a network of support for individuals to experience all those levels of help and care.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really helpful imagery. And I know in particular, thinking about the counseling side, I had mentioned this on one of our podcasts a couple months ago. When you think about the past and the influence of our history, oftentimes for most of us, we find ourselves, if we're not aware of our story, reliving our story, or having it rather relive us, both in forms of like reenactment or reaction to that. And here's an interesting another stat for you. Thinking about pastors and this whole idea of kind of our own well and the need to have that full. Many of us started life with a very empty well. Interestingly, one study that I found referenced the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, the ACEs, referenced that 87% of pastors experienced at least one ACE as compared to 67% of the general population. Another kind of story that fits in with that, talking with a counselor friend of mine, Byron Kaler, he said that for people that are in counseling work, most therapists' first memory is a negative one. And as he shared that, I started thinking about sitting with pastors, and the same has been true, that most of the pastors that I sit with, they developed this passion to help others because honestly, they weren't helped well. And so thinking about this reality of the need for input in our lives, you described really well 3 different kinds of input that might be helpful to people in ministry. Tell us a little bit more about what is it that you do specifically through Fermata that helps people in the present hear from God and process what God's saying to them.
Yeah. I love the analogy that you used with this idea of input. And that was actually one of the foundational ideas that birthed Fermata in the first place. So Fermata came from my doctoral dissertation. When I was working on my DMin, I chose to focus on an aspect of ministry that wasn't really talked about, but everyone knew it was there, and it was burnout. And when I looked at pastoral burnout in particular, that same dynamic played out, that these were people that were expected to pour their lives out for people, to spend themselves emotionally, to spend themselves relationally. And the unspoken elephant in the room is that a lot of times they didn't have anyone that was pouring back into them. And the challenge that existed there was at a certain point when you pour out and you are not getting refilled. There are different clinical terms for it. One of them is compassion fatigue. And the other one, I believe, is a cousin of compassion fatigue, which is clinical burnout. So when I looked at that phenomenon that was going on, and this is when I was working as a chaplain at Portland Rescue Mission, one of the most draining ministries you could imagine. When you're in the heart of Portland, Oregon, any story that you can imagine about darkness, drugs, addiction, abuse, all of that was playing out front and center in the work that we did. And so I just saw this burnout continually happening. And the sad way I described it was you get these big-hearted people who jump into a ministry because they want to love and serve, but they get grinded through the system without the proper support, without the proper foundations, and then they end up becoming jaded and sometimes even walking away from ministry and faith altogether. And so when I studied that, when I looked at that, kind of birthed in me this idea, how do we address this in a way that is more than just spiritual platitudes? How do we address this in a way that is clinically informed, but also grounded on spiritual truths? And so Fermata was kind of birthed in that idea of supporting ministry folks, people in the nonprofit sector. So it also includes nurses, doctors, it includes teachers, and providing support and what we would call wraparound services to help them deal with the weight of their past, stay grounded in a relationship with God in the present moment, but also realize there's this work that God is doing to build hope for the future. And from up kind of birthed around that idea, how do we help people create a bucket, a category to place their struggles and their suffering, and to realize God is there. And part of that process of God's presence is other people pouring into them, giving them direction, encouraging, affirming, pouring back in so that they could experience ministry for the long haul.
Wow. Thank you for the important work you're doing there. That's really, really significant. And I know even just referencing some of the other stats I'd looked up in preparation for our conversation, the levels of burnout, are growing exponentially as time has proceeded. I looked at stats from 2015 to 2020, and it almost doubled in terms of percentages of pastors experiencing burnout. Protecting your clients, confidentiality in this conversation, but I do want to ask you a question. What are you noticing as you sit with people in these helping professions, and you're doing this really important work that you're doing? What are you noticing about their experiences in this current cultural moment?
Yeah, Micah, that's a good question. Um, I would say some of the trends that I notice, and this might be more than just the helping professions, this might be Christendom in the West as a general idea. There is this idea that following God and doing the right thing is going to mean you have to give up everything, and to a certain extent, you become miserable. We glorify these stories of martyrs who have given up everything, right? The missionaries who kind of neglect their family in order to do the work that's in front of them. We highlight the achievements of their sacrifice, but don't really talk about the dark underside of what's there. And a lot of times, these narratives propel people into ministry and helping vocations that set them up for a certain level of disappointment and failure because they're looking to do something superhuman. Right.
Yeah.
That ties in with one of the research pieces that I found in my dissertation, that at the end of the day, God doesn't ask us to be superhuman. The way that we most glorify God is by honoring our limitation and not getting into the spiritual hubris of saying, I can fix everything. Right. We are not supposed to be Jesus in every situation because we are not God. And I feel like that's a subtle mental game that people play in helping ministries, that, oh, I'm supposed to be Jesus in this situation, right? I'm supposed to live around my life for them. And while it is true, in some sense, I believe a lot of people haven't figured out how to separate that savior complex and learn to honor some of their limitations as a way to glorify God in the work that they do. So that's probably the thread that I've seen with most folks, that lack of being able to draw good boundaries to honor self, to respect and honor the Sabbath as part of the work of ministry. And I would say that is maybe born from the Protestant work ethic, that maybe we just have to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, work really hard, and that's the thing that honors God. It's kind of undoing a little bit of that cultural narrative to enter into biblical narrative.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. And for our listeners, let's get really granular. And let's talk about, like you mentioned, honoring the Sabbath. So I sit with pastors nearly every day in coaching sessions. I do a thing called therapeutic mentoring, which is kind of counseling adjacent. And in both of those settings, I hear stories of pastors working week upon week with no day off and no set aside time where it's clear that they're not doing ministry work. They're just kind of on call. The way I've often phrased it is they're always working and never working, because the lines are so blurred between family life and ministry life. That's just one kind of symptom of where this might show up, of thinking you're superhuman. You don't have to, be paying attention to the limits of being enfleshed, being limited by the need for sleep or food, or that's another one, the classic, stack your day full of meetings as a pastor, and you never really slow down to have a nice, nourishing meal. You're really fueled on caffeine and adrenaline and the rush of all of that. What are some other examples of ways that you see, people in ministry avoiding those limits? And I want to highlight this for our viewers, not to say, here's all this shame and feel really bad about this, but so that we can get really specific in recognizing the need for some adjustments in our life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's maybe a cultural pressure that exists with people in pastoring roles and in service-oriented roles, um, that create a stigma when you move at a slower pace. And what I mean by that is to actually unplug and to have a lunch where you can slow down, enjoy your meal. And what I mean by that is to actually unplug and to have a lunch where you can slow down, enjoy your meal. You may get judgmental side eyes from in the work that you do saying, how come you have time to do this? Aren't you supposed to be busy? And what that creates is an unspoken culture that faithfulness equates to busyness, right? And when we allow the American version of Christianity to seep in, that says faithfulness is busyness and busyness justifies my existence as an individual, it becomes this tangled mess where if you aren't busy, who are you? And I feel like part of the remedy of that is to slow yourself down, enter into these moments of Sabbath and ask, where does my value come from? Right?
Yeah.
It's striking to me to take people to Jesus's baptism, right? So Jesus hasn't done anything spectacular yet. And God affirms, this is my son who I love. I am pleased with. Yeah. And that is the foundation from which Jesus works. Right? And it's inviting people to take that step back and ask, do I understand and do I feel deep in my bones the worth that God has for me? Because until I use that as foundation from which I serve and pour myself out, we are just playing this game of seeking validation from the rest of the world. And so when I work, especially with seminarians who are preparing to enter into this world, sometimes I try to do a reframe and I'll ask the question, not what does it mean to be successful? Because that's typically what we ask when we're entering into ministry, right? What are the numbers that I can prove to justify my existence? What are the initiatives I can move forward? How big is the building that we can fund? I don't ask, what does it mean to be successful? I always take it back a step and I say, what does it mean to be faithful?
Sure.
Because that's actually what God wants from you. To actually sit at his feet. Jesus wasn't speaking in hyperbole when he said one thing is necessary to Martha, right? Yeah, sit with me. And then you will have what it takes to serve, right? But we live in a Martha world, and I'm encouraging more of the Mary heart to come into the midst of ministry and service.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you captured that there's kind of an upstream approach, like you're swimming against the current, right, to slow down. And you're swimming against the cultural current in just kind of our, the world we live in, but also the ministry current that says, bigger is better, more is more. And yet you have this counterintuitive kingdom in the Gospels where it's kind of this less is more and functioning from a place of fullness, like Jesus's voice from the Father, like, you're my son in whom I'm well pleased. It's such a collision and kind of a paradox because most of us are like, we feel empty. And so we try to help other people.
Yeah.
And thinking that by helping, we would also get helped, only to find ourselves oftentimes feeling quite dry, burnt out, compassion fatigue, all the things you described. Like, I remember reading, and this is an older book, there's some more current books on the similar topic or the same topic, but reading Pete Scazzero's Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. And he faced, his own human limitations in a really significant way and kind of was collided with those when his wife said, I'm done going to your church. And that was his deeper journey introduction. Like, how do I save my marriage? How do I save myself? How do I save my ministry? And through that journey of learning a lot of these different kinds of limitations that we need to embrace and the gift of grieving, his church, I believe it's New Life or something along those lines, New Life Fellowship, they decided that one of the ways that they would discern God's will for them as a church was to say that if any new initiative would take them into kind of such a busy pace that they could no longer live in a healthy way, they would discern that that was not God's will for them as a church. And I found that really, really profound because, again, the things that are celebrated in many of our churches is like, we're so busy. Like, we just did, 10 services on Christmas and 12 on Easter. And not that those things are bad, but it's what's the ebb and flow? Are we doing this work from a place of rest? Or are we doing this work trying to get ourselves some of the accolades or some of the refreshing that's needed? So, Ahshuwah, you've been listening to us gab on for a few minutes. What are some thoughts or questions you might have for us?
So I'd love to write the book, Physically Healthy Spirituality.
Oh, yeah.
And I think there's a type of like modern day Gnosticism in some of these conversations that really separates the physical, spiritual, emotional parts of our lives.
Yeah.
And even in like the three different categories of like helpers and Barnabases that pastors might need of the right, these spiritual directors and coaches and counselors. I feel like, and obviously you do some of the hard work in those sessions of talking. The real hard work is rubber meets the road in your doing and applying. But still it's like talk doctoring, right? It's still saying we're going to talk and find some solutions and get to the problems, and you're going to be helped through the talking. And for me personally, I actually experienced some of the most profound transformation in my life over the last 3 years through a physical coach and physical trainer and a dietitian.
Yeah.
Right. So, and it's true, I needed someone outside of myself to help me with healthy rhythms and patterns. But it was it was not a religious or analytical type of professional. It's someone that studies the effect that food has on your physical and emotional being, and someone that studied how do you grow in fitness? How do you lift weights properly to not hurt your back? How do you develop these rhythms and rituals in your life of growing in physical fitness? And I had dealt with some debilitating health issues that I just couldn't get over. Back issues, knee issues. And so I said, dude, help me figure this out. And it was, and I'm an ectomorph, kind of like always been lean my whole life. So I've never had to diet. That hasn't been like a part of my world, but actually making decisions about these are the foods I will not eat and these are the foods that I will, created a context where I'm constantly saying no to my flesh in just a practical everyday kind of thing. That then bore fruit of self-control in other areas in life. And then when I said, okay, at this time of the evening, I'm going to go work out and I'm going to push myself, or at this time of the afternoon, I'm going to run my dog. And what I experienced is I'm not currently a pastor, but I'm in ministry and I do this. Like, we're sitting on a call. Like, I do this for hours on end. I'm working on projects and I'm typing up presentations and I'm going out and meeting someone over coffee. Like, I do people work all day long and computer work. And then I have pent up anxiety. I have pent up energy. My neck is stiff. My back like hurting, and I'm in my mid-40s. So it's already like the clock is ticking. I need an outlet that's physical. And then I have boys that I'm raising. They need a dad that can wrestle with them and give them outlet and model to them a healthy lifestyle. And not just sitting here, like I say, no, too much screen time. And literally, I've spent all day on a screen. But somehow it's fine for me and it's bad for the 10-year-old, right? And so it was that part of my life that then bore fruit spiritually, that bore fruit emotionally, relationally, in my marriage, my kid, all these things. So is that just a major gap and blind spot? Like, and again, I think probably, Micah, you could pull up the stats on what percentage of pastors are overweight.
Right.
Now, I know that can be a sensitive topic, but I can like look at a dude's belly or you can line them up and you're like, guess the pastor on the lineup. And you might be able to narrow it down by the belly size. And this sounds crass, and I'm so sorry if you're listening. You're like, I take offense. But it's kind of true. So, okay, help me out. Like, am I just off of my rocker, or is this something really important?
Well, just anecdotally, I remember a number of years ago being at a conference with denominational leaders and pastors, and it was just kind of like, wow, it's the anomaly if you are physically fit. And it's more commonplace that you'd be, 30 to 100 pounds overweight. And that's part of that is because we're professional, like going out to eat people. Like that's, like you said, being on screen, that's the post-pandemic reality. But pre-pandemic, it was like, I'm going to coffee, then I'm going to lunch, then I'm doing a dinner meeting. And it's never, it's like, it's pizza and hamburgers. It's not salads and juice drinks or whatever. So I think what you're capturing, Ahshuwah, or what I wonder is if this is really kind of tapping into the reality that we're holistic people. We're not just soul. We have cognitive function and we have physicality. And when you talk about health, it has to really tap into all of those, because if we're physically unhealthy, it's going to impact our emotional health. It's going to impact our spiritual health. If we're spiritually unhealthy, it might impact those other areas. If we're emotionally unhealthy, obviously it impacts those other areas as well. And I had a similar, for me, my awakening, kind of a funny story. I was 30 years old, pastoring a quote unquote successful church where I got 1 day a week off, and I worked probably about 60 hours a week.
Cool, Micah. I'd only rested 1 day a week.
That's right. Well, my Sabbath day was also like do all the family chores and shopping and everything else. Kind of, it wasn't a healthy season for me. And I went out bird hunting, which is something I enjoy doing. And I had a runner, which means you winged a bird and it's running. And I started chasing this bird, and I'm in, full hunting waders, just crossed a creek, running after this bird. My dog is between me and the bird, so I can't shoot it again because I'm afraid I'm going to shoot the dog. We run for maybe a quarter of a mile, and I spent the next 30 minutes just coughing because just that little exertion of energy was more than I could handle at that time. And I was like, something's got to change. This was my big Kairos moment around physical exercise. Like, I've got to stay fit of it. At that time, I was only 30, and the pressures of church planting, again, it's like, it's easy to turn to things like ice cream or drinking or not getting enough rest or whatever it might be, and those things have impact on our physicality. So I don't know. My take, Ahshuwah, is that you're knocking on the right door, and there's a lot there to be mindful. When we think about input in our lives, physical health's another area to be growing and considering. I don't know, Dom, anything you might add to that?
Yeah, I love it, because that suspicion that Gnosticism has creeped up again is absolutely true. We don't talk about it, but there's a reason why theology actually works. If we understand a robust biblical anthropology, we can save ourselves a lot of pain when we realize God intentioned for us to be different from angels, and that we are the hybrids. We are the dirt people who are infused with spirit. We are both. And God values that so much, he will actually resurrect both in the new kingdom. And so this idea of learning to value our material, physical aspects is not divorced from Christianity, or at least it not to be, right? The acts of worship, in terms of prioritizing what we actually need for our bodies, is part of our spiritual worship, right? And I think this disconnect from what our bodies need and this conviction that many people may feel, it might be evidence in the reality that if you're having a hard time managing where does my body fit in all of this, I would also venture to guess you don't know how to use fasting as a spiritual discipline. Because fasting was meant to ground us in our physical need. And there's a reason why I think the American church sucks at fasting. It's because we don't have a good understanding of how our bodies fit in with our spiritual lives and our Christian lives in general. So, yes,
But I want to translate for our millennial and younger listeners. When he's saying fasting, he's not talking about not looking at your smartphone or your social media. He's talking about I think you're talking about, Dom, not eating food for like a period of time as a way to connect with God and recognize our dependence on Him.
in a culture like ours, where somehow we've bought into this idea we should eat, 8 times a day, whatever that is. It divorces us from maybe even the expectations that Jesus had when he said, when you fast, this ought to be part of our spiritual lives. Yeah. The moment we start overly spiritualizing and saying it is all about what happens internally, and we start divorcing our physical bodies, I think Ahshuwah was absolutely spot on when he said you can physically spot where that happens in our lives. And it's the same caution that I think we as humans exercise when we come to a doctor who tells us, you really got to quit smoking. And you're like, oh, okay. And then you watch them walk out of that appointment to the smoking area and they start smoking, and you see the hypocrisy, right? And then you also come to churches where pastors say, this is what you need to do to thrive in your spiritual life. And then we see them abusing their bodies. And there is a suspicion that ought to pop up in our minds and say, is this good advice? Is it coming from a source that I can trust? And part of our evangelistic message, part of our faithful presence to one another is our physical bodies. How we present to one another is part of our Christian lives. And so I can't say enough, the spiritual disciplines is not a navel-gazing exercise. It is meant to move our bodies. And I love the way Richard Rohr talks about it. We're supposed to be contemplatives in action. The practices we're supposed to have ought to define how we live our lives. And that does include times of good rest, good sleep, or good food, good movement with our body. It's all tied in together with this idea of stewardship. What do we do to honor the gifts that God has given us? Because our bodies are supremely the primary way that God speaks to us through our lived experience. He speaks to us through His Word. He speaks to us through His Spirit. But we ignore the fact that God speaks to us through our bodies all the time. We've ignored almost completely in American society.
Wow. Thank you. Man, this has been a rich conversation. And I know most listeners will probably catch this in the new year or just before the new year. A great time maybe to reflect on some goals you would have of like, what's one area God's inviting you to grow physically, emotionally, spiritually? Is that getting support and coaching, looking forward? Is that getting support in spiritual direction, like being present in the current moment and hearing God's voice? Or is that looking to the past and understanding some of the impact there? Any of those might be great options for you this coming year. And we want to encourage you in that way. Dominic, if somebody wanted to do spiritual direction work with you, how would they get in touch with you and hear more about that?
Yeah, I have a website for Fermata. It's fermataministries.com. You can visit there and follow the links. If you want to schedule a time to meet with me, we can do a consult and talk about what the goals are. And then if we decide we want to meet, we can move forward with that. Or if after the assessment, maybe there are other resources that might be more helpful, such as counseling or coaching, we have other folks at Fermata who do that work as well. My wife partners with me in some of that. And what I'd encourage with that is, just as I've seen the taboo around counseling kind of dissipate over the last couple decades or so, where you used to whisper, oh, you should talk to someone about it. That was code for you need to see a therapist because you're messed up. I feel like the taboo with spiritual formation and specifically spiritual direction is starting to fade away too. That this isn't a crisis type of service. This is actually for the ongoing health of our souls. That's right. And I feel that way about counseling as well. And I feel that way about coaching as well. And obviously about pastoring. That these aren't signs of efficiency or immorality. but it is actually an act of faithfulness to say, how can I tend to the resources that the Lord has given me? And how do I use these talents well in order to bring the kingdom of God? And just to remove some of the stigma that you're seeing someone who will help you grow. I feel like we all need a little bit of humility and an openness to do that. So just an invite for everyone to practice that.
I love it. Thank you so much. I do want to mention one other thing related to that. I mentioned this counseling scholarship earlier. If that's one of the needs that you want to pursue this coming year and you're a person in ministry, or your spouse, you're a person in ministry and your spouse wants to pursue counseling, we've got this counseling scholarship available, and we've got a list of referrals for different counselors in the Portland and Vancouver area. If you'd like to participate in that, you can reach out, Micah at thrivechurchplanting.org, and I'm happy to point you in the right direction with that. Thanks for the time, everyone. I guess I want to close with one last thought. I was reading a email post from Adam Young, who does the Place We Found, the Place We Find Ourselves podcast, and in that, he just talked about, like, as we might experience some dysregulation through the holiday, one of the best things we can do is show ourselves kindness. And when I say dysregulation, I mean things like anxiety, stress. Maybe you even felt some shame from our conversation today. That's a form of dysregulation. Instead of camping out on those painful kinds of feelings, it's an opportunity to ask the question, how can I show myself kindness today? So want to leave you with that thought. Thanks again for being with us today.
And real quick, the one thing I'd add is on the physical side, if part of your New Year's resolution is getting in shape, don't just do the gym membership. Actually find a coach or trainer. And I have some recommendations. If someone needs that, they can email me at ahsh@brilliancelabs.org.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com, where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.